Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. The Howling Wind Brings Voices from Beyond. Scary story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. The Arrival at the Haunted House. Emma Collins gripped the steering wheel of her SUV as she navigated the winding country road. The dense woods on either side seemed to close in, their shadows lengthening in the late afternoon sun. She glanced at the GPS, its screen flickering as if uncertain of their destination. "Almost there," she muttered, more to herself than to her absent passenger. The house loomed into view, its silhouette stark against the gray sky. Emma's heart sank. The estate was a far cry from the sleek, modern apartment she'd left behind in Chicago. The old Victorian structure appeared to sag under the weight of decades, its paint peeling like sunburned skin. Ivy snaked up the walls, reclaiming the building inch by inch. Emma parked the SUV and stepped out, the gravel crunching under her boots. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. She pulled her jacket tighter, though the chill wasn't entirely from the weather. Her aunt's death had been sudden, and though they hadn't been close, Emma felt a pang of unease about inheriting this rundown relic. With a deep breath, she approached the front door. The brass knocker was tarnished, the wooden door beneath it scarred by years of neglect. She pushed it open, the hinges creaking a mournful welcome. Inside, the house was dark and musty, the sunlight barely penetrating the grime-coated windows. Dust motes danced in the air, disturbed by her entrance. Emma flicked on the light switch, but the bulbs only flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to writhe on the walls. She made her way through the grand hallway, past ornate but faded wallpaper and cobwebbed corners. The oppressive silence was occasionally broken by the distant, eerie howling of the wind outside. In the attic, amidst a sea of forgotten relics, Emma discovered the journal. Its leather cover was cracked and worn, as if it had been handled by countless trembling hands. She opened it gingerly, revealing pages filled with frantic, spidery handwriting. The entries spoke of voices, carried by the wind whispers that grew louder and more insistent with each passing day. Final entry was a desperate plea for someone to understand and end the torment. As night fell, the temperature in the house dropped noticeably. Emma wrapped herself in a blanket she had found, attempting to ward off the creeping cold. The howling wind outside grew louder, becoming an almost rhythmic wail. Emma tried to convince herself it was just the old house settling, the wind playing tricks on her tired mind. But then came the whispers. They were faint at first, like murmurs from a distant conversation, but they grew clearer, more urgent. Emma's heart raced as she listened, her breath visible in the chilly air. The whispers seemed to call her name, mingling with the howling wind, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. Emma's skepticism was wavering. Chapter 2. The Enigmatic Wind and Local Superstitions. Emma's first night in the old house was a restless one. The wind howled like a mournful spirit, rattling the windows and making the wooden beams groan in protest. She tossed and turned, trying to ignore the whispers that seemed to seep through the walls. Each creak of the house felt amplified in the oppressive silence that followed, leaving her wide-eyed and uneasy. Morning brought no relief. Emma stumbled out of bed, bleary-eyed and determined to shake off the unsettling feelings. As she prepared breakfast, the lights in the kitchen flickered erratically, plunging her into momentary darkness before sputtering back to life. A sudden chill swept through the room, making her shiver despite the thermostat being set to a comfortable temperature. She rubbed her arms, trying to dispel the goosebumps that clung to her skin. By mid-morning, Emma decided it was time to explore the small town nearby. Maybe a change of scenery would lift her spirits. The town was quaint, with its historic buildings and friendly faces, but an undercurrent of unease seemed to linger. At the local diner, Emma struck up a conversation with the waitress, a middle-aged woman named Ruth with a knowing glint in her eye. "Moved into that old place on Willow Street, did you?" Ruth asked, her tone nonchalant, but her eyes sharp. Emma nodded. "Yes, that's right. I'm just trying to get the place sorted. It's a bit more run down than I expected." Ruth's smile faltered slightly. "You've heard the stories, then?" Emma raised an eyebrow. "Stories? Oh, everyone in town knows about that house. It's got a dark history. They say it's cursed, and there's some truth to it. Your aunt wasn't exactly normal." Emma frowned. "What do you mean?" Ruth leaned in, her voice lowering. "Years ago, your aunt was into some pretty strange stuff. Rumor has it she dabbled in occult rituals. They say she tried to summon something that never should have been brought into this world." Emma's skepticism was tested as Ruth continued. "There's been talk of voices and shadows that move on their own. People who've lived there before have all reported strange phenomena, lights flickering, unexplained cold spots. It's as if the house is alive, and not in a good way." Unsettled, Emma returned to the house with a heavy heart. The more Ruth's words echoed in her mind, the more the house seemed to warp and shift around her. The flickering lights and sudden chills felt less like quirks of an old building and more like symptoms of something darker. By evening, the whispers resumed. They were louder now, their urgency mounting as the howling wind joined in. Emma's doubts about the local rumors began to erode as the supernatural phenomena intensified. Her rational explanations faltered under the weight of her growing fear. The house wasn't just old, it felt alive, and its presence was becoming increasingly malevolent. Emma paced the creaking floorboards, her heart pounding. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her, waiting. Each unexplained noise and cold draft seemed to challenge her sanity, forcing her to confront the eerie possibility that the stories were true. The night stretched before her, filled with whispers and shadows, as she grappled with the chilling reality of the house's dark past. Chapter 3: Voices from the Wind and Hidden Secrets. The relentless whispers from the previous night seemed to have seeped into Emma's very bones. She lay awake in the pitch-black room, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Sleep eluded her, replaced by unsettling visions and the feeling of invisible eyes boring into her. Each gust of wind outside seemed to carry fragments of her name, whispered in a tone that was both familiar and foreign. Morning brought no reprieve. Emma stumbled through her daily routine, haunted by an ever-present sense of dread. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror looked haggard, her eyes hollow and unsteady. The hallucinations were becoming more vivid. Shadows danced at the edge of her vision, and the air was thick with an invisible presence that she couldn't quite pin down. Desperate for answers, Emma decided to delve into her aunt's past. She rummaged through the attic, sifting through dusty boxes and old furniture until she found a locked chest. With a bit of effort, she managed to pry it open. Inside were various documents, old letters, and faded photographs. But what caught her eye was a series of journals and grimy notebooks filled with frantic scrawls. One journal detailed a series of occult practices and rituals. The entries grew increasingly erratic, describing attempts to contact entities from beyond the grave. Words like summoning, pact, and ancient forces leaped off the pages, making Emma's skin crawl. Among the records were failed attempts at exorcisms and a desperate plea for help from an unknown entity. As Emma pored over the material, she found disturbing details that linked the rituals to her own family history. The more she read, the more she realized that the entity her aunt had been trying to control was deeply connected to her own fears and traumas. The voices in the wind seemed to be taunting her with personal memories, her childhood fears, her recent anxieties, and the unresolved pain of her family's fractured past. The more Emma discovered, the clearer it became that the entity was not only tied to her aunt's dark dealings, but was also targeting her specifically. The whispers in the wind grew more coherent, now speaking in cryptic and menacing tones that seemed to echo her own inner demons. They seemed to know intimate details about her regrets, her insecurities, her every vulnerability. Emma's fear and confusion mounted as she pieced together the connection between the entity in her own life. The house, which once seemed like a mere relic, was now a living nightmare. It felt as though the very walls were closing in on her, and every whisper, every gust of wind was a reminder of the entity's malevolent presence. The weight of her discoveries pressed down on her shoulders, and Emma felt as though she was being suffocated by her own past and the house's sinister history. The psychological strain was overwhelming, leaving her on the brink of a breakdown. As night fell once again, the entity's influence seemed to grow stronger, promising a night filled with more whispered revelations and terrifying confrontations. Emma was caught in a web of horror and personal anguish, her grip on reality slipping with each passing moment. Chapter 4. The haunting escalates. The nights at the old house had transformed from unsettling to outright terrifying. Emma's attempts to cling to normalcy were failing miserably. The voices in the wind had become more aggressive, their whispers now sharp and demanding, echoing her deepest fears. The temperature in the house plummeted without warning, leaving Emma shivering even under layers of clothing. Cold spots seemed to follow her from room to room, making her feel as though invisible fingers were tracing patterns on her skin. The apparitions began appearing more frequently. They were fleeting figures, glimpsed out of the corner of her eye, shadowy shapes that vanished when she turned to confront them. Emma would find herself staring into corners where she felt a presence, only to see nothing but darkness. The sense of being watched was pervasive, making every creak of the house and gust of wind seem menacing. Emma's efforts to reach out for help only seemed to make things worse. Her phone, which had been working perfectly before, now malfunctioned inexplicably. Calls to friends and family were met with eerie silence or static, leaving her feeling increasingly isolated. Even the local townsfolk, who had initially shown sympathy, began to avoid her. Whispers of her sanity began circulating, adding to her mounting sense of loneliness. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched across the house, Emma decided to confront the entity. Armed with the knowledge she had gleaned from her aunt's journals, she set up a makeshift ritual in the living room, hoping to appease or banish the malevolent force. As she began chanting the incantations from the journal, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. The wind outside howled as if in response, shaking the windows with a ferocity that made the glass rattle. Emma's voice wavered with fear as the room filled with an unnatural darkness. Candles she had lit flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Suddenly, the air grew oppressive, and the entity manifested before her, a chilling, spectral figure with hollow eyes and a distorted, menacing grin. It was as if her deepest nightmares had coalesced into a single, horrifying presence. The figure hovered above the ground, its form shifting and swirling as it let out a guttural growl that reverberated through Emma's bones. In a desperate attempt to finish the ritual, Emma's hands trembled as she reached for the sacred symbols she had laid out. But before she could complete the final incantation, the entity lashed out. A cold, invisible force slammed into her, sending her crashing against the fireplace. The impact knocked the wind out of her, and she lay dazed, her vision swimming. As Emma struggled to regain her senses, the entity's voice boomed through the room, its tone a chilling mix of satisfaction and fury. It revealed its true nature, not just a malevolent spirit, but an ancient force of darkness that thrived on fear and despair. The revelation was as horrifying as it was overwhelming, leaving Emma with a profound sense of dread and a deep realization of the stakes involved. The confrontation left Emma battered and bruised, her physical and emotional limits pushed to the brink. As the entity's presence receded, the room fell eerily silent, the air thick with the promise of more terror to come. Emma was left alone in the dark, her resolve shaken, but her determination hardened. The battle was far from over, and the entity's true nature was more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. Chapter 5: Descent into Madness. Emma's world had become a spiraling vortex of fear and confusion. The aftermath of her confrontation with the entity had left her battered and disoriented, but the real torment was only beginning. The voices, once whispers carried on the wind, had escalated into a relentless cacophony that invaded every corner of her mind. They were no longer mere murmurs, but aggressive, invasive shouts that echoed her deepest insecurities and fears. Each day blurred into the next as Emma struggled to distinguish reality from hallucination. The walls of the house seemed to close in on her, the shadows morphing into grotesque shapes that seemed to leer at her with malevolent intent. Mirrors distorted her reflection, making her appear as a gaunt, hollow-eyed specter. The whispers grew louder, their messages more coherent and accusatory, attacking her sanity with a relentless barrage. Desperation drove Emma to attempt an escape. She packed her belongings and tried to leave the house, only to find the doors inexplicably jammed. She pounded on the windows, screaming for help, but the sounds of her cries were swallowed by the oppressive silence of the house. Each failed attempt only deepened her sense of entrapment. The entity seemed to toy with her, manipulating her every move and keeping her ensnared in a web of terror. In her frantic state, Emma's mind played tricks on her. She saw faces in the wallpaper, heard footsteps that weren't there, and felt an invisible hand resting heavily on her shoulder. Sleep eluded her, and the constant strain began to erode her grip on reality. Her reflection in the darkened windows seemed to move independently, mocking her plight. One night, driven by a growing desperation, Emma stumbled upon a hidden panel behind an old bookcase in the attic. With trembling hands, she pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. Her heart raced as she descended, each step echoing ominously in the confined space. At the bottom, she discovered a hidden chamber, its walls lined with occult symbols and shelves cluttered with dusty tomes and bizarre artifacts. The room was a shrine to the dark rituals her aunt had practiced. The air was thick with the scent of aged parchment and decay. Among the artifacts, Emma found an old ledger detailing a sinister pact made with the entity. Her aunt had bargained with an ancient force, trading her soul for promises of power and immortality. The entries revealed the entity's insidious nature, its hunger for fear and despair, and its manipulative tactics to ensnare new victims. The dark discovery was a crushing blow to Emma's already fragile psyche. She realized that the entity had not only been tormenting her, but had also been feeding off her fear to gain more power. The knowledge of her aunt's pact and the entity's true nature left Emma feeling a profound sense of betrayal and horror. The weight of the revelation, coupled with the relentless psychological assault, drove Emma further into the abyss of madness. She was trapped in a house that was both a prison and a conduit for an ancient, malevolent force. The line between reality and delusion had all but vanished, leaving Emma on the brink of a complete breakdown. The darkness of the hidden chamber mirrored the darkness closing in on her mind, threatening to consume her entirely. Chapter 6: The Ritual and Final Confrontation. The discovery of the hidden chamber had left Emma shattered, but it also ignited a flicker of determination within her. The knowledge she had unearthed about her aunt's dark pact with the entity offered a glimmer of hope. Breaking the pact could free her from the relentless torment. However, the price was steep, demanding a significant personal sacrifice or act of courage. As the entity's grip tightened around her, Emma knew she had no choice but to confront the malevolent force directly. With grim resolve, Emma began preparing for the final confrontation. The house seemed to sense her intent and transformed into a nightmarish maze. Hallways shifted, doors led to nowhere, and the familiar rooms twisted into grotesque parodies of themselves. The walls seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and the air was thick with a palpable sense of menace. Emma's path to the entity was fraught with obstacles. Shadows coalesced into monstrous forms that lunged at her, and cold winds howled, carrying whispers of her deepest fears. Each step was a struggle against the overwhelming darkness, but Emma pressed on, driven by the knowledge that her only chance of escape lay in confronting the entity and breaking the pact. In the heart of the house, Emma discovered a grand, decayed ballroom that seemed to be the focal point of the entity's power. The room was adorned with grotesque symbols and faded tapestries depicting nightmarish scenes. At the center stood a ceremonial altar, its surface covered in remnants of past rituals and dark artifacts. The air was charged with an oppressive energy that seemed to push back against her every move. Emma recalled the details from her aunt's journals and knew what she had to do. The ritual required her to face her deepest fears and demonstrate an act of true courage. As she began the incantation, the entity manifested before her in its full, horrifying form, a grotesque amalgamation of shadow and malice, its eyes burning with a cold, malevolent light. The entity's voice boomed through the room, taunting and threatening Emma. It seemed to feed off her fear, growing more powerful with each moment. As the ritual progressed, Emma was forced to confront visions of her past traumas, failed relationships, lost opportunities, and unresolved regrets. Each vision was a direct assault on her psyche, designed to break her spirit. Despite the overwhelming fear, Emma focused on the one thing that gave her strength, her desire to reclaim her life and escape the entity's clutches. With each incantation, she felt herself tapping into a deep reservoir of inner strength and courage. The entity howled in fury as its power began to wane, its form flickering and distorting. Climactic showdown reached its peak as Emma completed the final, crucial part of the ritual. The entity writhed in agony, its once unshakable form beginning to dissolve. In a last, desperate act, Emma confronted the entity head-on, channeling all her fear and determination into a powerful act of defiance. With a final, piercing scream, the entity was banished, its form collapsing into a swirling vortex of darkness that was sucked into the altar. The house fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting as the malevolent force was expelled. Emma, exhausted and battered, collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face. The house began to return to its former state, the malevolent energy dissipating. The ordeal had taken a toll on her, but she had faced her fears and broken the dark pact. As dawn's first light filtered through the windows, Emma knew that she had triumphed over the darkness. The house, once a prison of terror, now held a quiet, eerie calm. The nightmare was over, but the scars of her battle would remain as a haunting reminder of the struggle against the malevolent entity and the strength she had found within herself. Chapter 7: Aftermath and transformation. As the first light of dawn filtered through the grimy windows, Emma slowly stirred from where she had collapsed on the ballroom floor. The oppressive weight of the entity's presence had lifted, replaced by an eerie, almost unnatural silence. The once nightmarish house seemed to have exhaled a deep sigh of relief, its walls now appearing slightly less foreboding, though still scarred by the recent turmoil. Emma rose, her body aching and her mind reeling from the harrowing events of the night. The house itself bore the marks of the confrontation. The grotesque symbols that had once adorned the ballroom had faded, and the heavy, dark aura had dissipated. Sunlight streamed in through the windows, casting a warm glow over the now cleaned remnants of the altar. It was as if the house was trying to cleanse itself of the lingering darkness, though the stains of its haunted past were still visible in the creaking floorboards and the dust-covered corners. Emma's reflection in the cracked mirror in the foyer seemed different. Her eyes held a newfound depth, a mix of fatigue and hard-earned wisdom. The ordeal had left her scarred, both physically and mentally. She had faced her deepest fears and emerged victorious, but the psychological impact was profound. The strength she had discovered within herself was tempered by the shadows of her past traumas and the sorrow of losing her estranged aunt. In the weeks that followed, Emma struggled with the remnants of her experience. The house, now eerily quiet and still, became a place of reflection and healing. She found solace in the quiet moments, trying to piece together her fractured sense of self and grapple with the loss of her aunt. Though the entity's influence had waned, the impact of the encounter lingered in her dreams and waking thoughts. Each creak of the house, every gust of wind, was a reminder of the dark presence that had once been so pervasive. Despite her efforts to move on, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The house, though seemingly calm, held an undercurrent of residual unease. The occasional draft, the inexplicable flicker of lights, and the soft, distant howling of the wind kept her on edge. It was as if the entity's influence had not been entirely eradicated, but had been subdued, leaving behind a lingering sense of dread. One evening, as Emma sat by the fireplace, she noticed a peculiar draft sweeping through the room. The temperature dropped suddenly, and a faint whisper seemed to carry through the air, just on the edge of her hearing. She turned, half expecting to see a shadowy figure, but found nothing but the stillness of the room. The ambiguous closure of her ordeal left Emma with a chilling realization. The entity's defeat had not brought a complete end to the darkness that had once consumed the house. Instead, it had transformed, leaving behind an unsettling ambiguity. The house, while quieter, was still a place where fear could lurk just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to return. As Emma prepared to leave the house for good, she cast one last glance over her shoulder. The old structure stood tall, its facade now bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. The house had been changed by her confrontation, but so had she. The echoes of her battle with the entity would forever be a part of her, a reminder of the darkness she had faced and the strength she had found within herself. The lingering hints of the entity's presence served as a haunting reminder that the battle against darkness was never truly over it, only transformed and waited for another chance to be unleashed. Chapter 8: Echoes of the Past and Final Twist. The sun had set on the final day Emma spent at the old house. She stood in the doorway, the soft light of dusk casting long shadows across the yard. As she prepared to leave behind the place that had become both a prison and a battleground, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The house, though now quiet, seemed to harbor a secret, a final, unsettling echo of the horror that had once consumed it. Emma had spent the past few weeks attempting to move forward, sorting through her aunt's belongings and preparing the house for sale. Despite her efforts, the sense of dread lingered like an unwelcome guest. The drafts she had once dismissed now seemed more deliberate, more sinister. The howling wind, which had once been the entity's cruel taunt, now seemed to carry with it an unspoken warning. On her last evening in the house, Emma decided to do one final sweep of the rooms, ensuring nothing was left behind. As she walked through the dimly lit hallways, she couldn't help but notice subtle, unsettling changes. The temperature seemed to drop with each step, and the shadows appeared to move with a life of their own. The house felt alive, as if it were waiting for something or someone. In the attic, where the hidden chamber had once held the dark relics of her aunt's pact, Emma found a new, peculiar addition, an old, weathered box that had not been there before. Its surface was covered in strange symbols, the same ones she had seen during the ritual. Her hands trembled as she opened the box, only to find it empty except for a single, folded piece of paper. With mounting anxiety, Emma unfolded the note. Written in a shaky, almost childlike script, it read, "You thought you escaped, but the past never truly lets go. The whispers will find you. The wind will always carry the echoes." A chill ran down her spine as the meaning of the message sank in. The entity's final act of malevolence was a reminder that the horrors she had faced were not entirely over. It was as if the entity had left a final mark on her life, a reminder that its influence could never be fully erased. As Emma left the house, for the last time, she glanced back at the darkened windows, half expecting to see a shadow watching her departure. The air was still, but the sense of unease remained, a lingering echo of the terror she had faced. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest hint of a whisper, a cruel reminder that while she had fought bravely, the scars of her ordeal would follow her. Driving away, Emma's mind raced with reflections on her experience. The house had changed her, leaving her with a deep sense of unease and a renewed understanding of the darkness that could lurk even in the most unsuspecting places. The final twist of the entity's message had left her with a haunting realization. The past never truly lets go, and the echoes of terror could resurface at any moment. As she disappeared down the road, the house stood silent and still, but the air was thick with a new, ominous energy. The final, chilling twist left Emma and the readers with a lingering sense of dread, a reminder that some horrors are never completely vanquished and that the past has a way of haunting us forever.